They mocked me in front of everyone, my father calling me a failure, my sister sneering at my career as if teaching art to children was beneath our family name, and the guests laughed along as if my life's work was a joke. But what none of them knew was that the night would end with the same people begging me for help, their voices trembling as they realized the daughter they ridiculed held the one thing they had lost forever: power and dignity. The chandeliers in the banquet hall glittered so brightly that for a moment I almost forgot I was standing in the middle of my father's 60th birthday party, not a stage production. The chandeliers in the banquet hall glittered so brightly that for a moment I almost forgot I was standing in the middle of my father's 60th birthday party, not a stage production. Crystal glasses clinked, silverware chimed against china, and the air carried the faint scent of roasted beef mixed with champagne bubbles. My heels tapped against the polished floor as I made my way toward the long table near the stage, every movement measured, every smile forced. Boston winters had always chilled me to the bone, but the room was overheated with laughter and pride, most of it centered on everyone but me. I adjusted the navy dress I had borrowed, hoping it made me look more confident than I felt. My parents were seated at the head table, their posture regal as if presiding over a kingdom. Richard Bennett. The birthday king was in a tailored suit with a crimson tie, shaking hands with his business partners and grinning so wide I could see the fillings in his molars. My mother Margaret sat beside him, pearls gleaming on her neck, her lips pressed into a smile that was more performance than warmth. And then there was Victoria, my older sister, basking in the glow, like the star she always believed she was. She leaned across the table, whispering something into my father's ear that made him roar with laughter. I slipped into a seat 2 chairs away from Jason, my younger brother. He avoided my eyes, choosing instead to busy himself with the breadbasket, tearing a roll apart in silence. That silence between us had become its own language, one of distance and unspoken guilt. The evening rolled on with speeches, laughter, and endless praise for my father's career. One partner after another took the microphone telling stories of Richard's business genius, his charm, his determination. I clapped politely, even as my hands felt cold and numb. Then Victoria's voice rang out sharper than the crystal note of a wine glass. She had taken the microphone without being asked, her sequined dress shimmering as she turned toward the crowd. My sister loved an audience, she always had. She lifted her glass and said with mock sincerity, "We all know Dad's greatest gift to the world is his legacy of success. Look at what he's built. Look at the empire he's created." Then she paused, her eyes flicking to me, lips curling. "But of course not everyone inherited that drive, did they?" The crowd chuckled. A low ripple of amusement swept across the tables. Victoria tilted her head toward me. "Who spends 4 years at college just to end up teaching finger painting to kids?" Laughter erupted, some polite, some cruel. I felt the heat rising to my face, my stomach twisting. My fingers gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles whitened. My father, instead of stopping her, leaned into the microphone with a booming laugh. "That's my Victoria, sharp as ever. Claire, sweetheart, you do what you love, but let's be honest, it isn't exactly the path to greatness, is it?" The room roared louder. I could feel eyes on me, evaluating, mocking, dismissing. My mother tapped her glass with a spoon, smiling, adding fuel to the fire. "Oh, Richard, don't be too hard on her. At least she keeps herself busy." Every word felt like a blade. I wanted to vanish, to dissolve into the velvet drapes and disappear. But I stayed rooted, frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. Jason kept his head down, jaw tight, still silent. He didn't look at me, didn't look at anyone, as if his silence would shield him from being dragged into the spectacle. His roll lay shredded into pieces on his plate, untouched. Someone behind me muttered, "Poor thing." Another voice said, "Maybe she should have gone into real estate like the rest of the family." More laughter, more judgment, each chuckle echoing like a verdict. My throat ached, my chest burned, but I refused to let them see tears. Across the table, I felt it. A gaze. I turned, and there was my grandmother Rose, seated in her wheelchair near the corner of the hall. 82 years old, white hair set neatly dressed in emerald silk, her presence quieter but no less commanding. Her eyes, sharp as glass, were fixed on me. But they weren't pitying. They were fierce, protective, simmering with something I hadn't seen in years. It was as though she was holding back words that could shatter the entire room. I drew in a shaky breath, sitting a little straighter, refusing to fold under the weight of their ridicule. For a moment, as the laughter and chatter swirled around me like a storm, I held on to that look in Grandma Rose's eyes, the silent promise of something more. And that was the only thing that kept me from breaking as the party carried on. The music swelled again, as the servers carried in a towering cake lit with 60 tiny flames. But my mind had already drifted far from the clapping and the chorus of Happy Birthday. The humiliation still stung, echoing louder than the laughter around me, and I found myself slipping into memories I had tried for years to bury. I remembered being 8 years old, standing in the family room, while Victoria showed off the miniature business she had created selling lemonade on the corner. My father clapped her on the shoulder and declared she had a mind for profit. Jason, only 6 then, recited math tables faster than anyone in his grade, and my mother praised his brilliance as if he were destined for Harvard. And then there was me, quiet in the corner with a sketch pad, coloring a clumsy drawing of a tree. My father barely looked at it before patting my head and calling me his little dreamer, a word that felt sweet at the time, but later soured into a dismissal. That dynamic never changed. At family dinners, Victoria was always the shining example, Jason, the promising son, and I, the fragile one, the girl who lived too much in her imagination. It became a script everyone knew, and I hated how easily I played my role. Years later, when I finally graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design in 2015, my heart was full of possibility. I had saved for months working side jobs and begging for donations so I could rent a small classroom in a rundown community center on the south side of Providence. I painted the cracked walls myself, bought cheap brushes and paper in bulk, and opened the door to kids who had nothing but curiosity in their eyes. The first day, only 4 children showed up. By the end of the first month, I had a dozen, each of them discovering color for the first time. I can still see their faces. Malik, who struggled with reading but found he could draw entire stories without a single word. Daniela, who carried her baby brother to class because she had no one else to watch him sketching with one hand while rocking the stroller with the other. I believed I was doing something meaningful, even if it was small, even if no one else cared. My family did not see it that way. One evening, Victoria drove up in her new Lexus, heels clicking as she strutted into the classroom unannounced. She looked around at the mismatched chairs, the peeling linoleum, the noise of children laughing and scribbling. Her smirk said it all before she even opened her mouth. "So this is what you've been hiding," she said, running her manicured fingers along one of the paint-stained tables. 4 years of college tuition for finger painting. The kids stared at her, confused by her tone. My face burned as I tried to usher her out, but she made sure her voice carried. "You could have joined me at Dad's firm. You could have been someone. Instead, you're wasting your time in this dump." That night, she posted a picture of the classroom on social media with a caption that read, "My sister traded a degree for babysitting crayons." Her friends commented with laughing emojis and clapping hands. I saw it only because a student's parent showed me concerned about how cruel it seemed. I wanted to fight back to defend what I was building, but I knew if I engaged, it would only fuel her. So I swallowed the hurt, locked the door that night, and sat alone in the quiet classroom until the hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound left. What they never knew, what Victoria never bothered to ask, was that I kept every note and drawing those children gave me. One in particular, I folded carefully and tucked into my wallet. It was written in wobbly handwriting on lined paper by a girl named Emily Carter, who had been painfully shy the first time she came to class. It said simply, "You changed my life. You made me believe I could be more." I read those words on nights when the weight of their ridicule threatened to crush me. I read them after classes when I worried about making rent, when I skipped meals, so the kids could have extra supplies, when I sat through holidays where Victoria bragged about her bonuses and Jason displayed his engineering awards. That letter was my anchor, a reminder that my path, invisible to them, mattered deeply to someone. Back in the ballroom, I sat at the table while the cake was cut and distributed the sweet smell filling the air. I smiled politely at strangers who barely remembered my name. Victoria basked in her role as the perfect daughter, Jason remained silent, and my parents glowed with satisfaction at the family they thought they had built. But under the surface of my humiliation, beneath the sting of their laughter, the memory of Emily's letter pulsed quietly, reminding me that even if they never saw my worth, someone out there already had. I reached for my glass of water, steadying my hand, and caught my grandmother's eyes again across the room. Her gaze had not softened. It was as though she knew the history behind every wound carved into me, as though she carried the weight of my past alongside me. And in that moment, I sensed that the night was far from over. The scrape of a chair against the floor cut through the noise of clinking forks and idle chatter. My grandmother Rose was rising slowly from her seat, her hands gripping the polished wood of her cane, her posture regal despite her age. The room quieted almost instinctively, as if everyone knew something extraordinary was about to happen. Her emerald silk dress shimmered under the chandeliers, and when she reached the microphone at the center of the stage, even the waitstaff froze in place. For years, my grandmother had been the quiet observer, the matriarch who let my parents run the show. But now her voice, steady and commanding, filled the hall. "Tonight is not just about celebrating my son Richard's birthday," she said, her eyes sweeping across the guests. "Tonight is about legacy." I sat up straighter, my pulse racing. A hush settled. Rose continued. "I have spent my life believing in the power of art and education to change lives. It is what carried me when little else did. And so I have established the Rose Grant Foundation, endowed with $18 million, dedicated to supporting young artists and children in need of opportunity." Gasps rippled across the tables. Guests turned to one another, whispering, eyes wide. My father's smile faltered, his hands tightening around his wine glass until it looked ready to shatter. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. Then my grandmother looked directly at me. Her gaze was unwavering, her voice ringing clear. "And the one who will lead this foundation, the one I trust to carry this vision forward, is my granddaughter, Claire Bennett." The air seemed to vanish from the room. I felt every pair of eyes lock onto me. My breath caught, and for a moment, I wondered if I had misheard. But the silence confirmed it. Me. The applause began hesitantly, a smattering of claps from distant relatives and family friends, unsure but compelled. Then it grew, spreading across the room like a wave. Yet the loudest sound to me was still the stunned silence of my parents. My father's jaw clenched, his birthday crown of admiration crumbling in an instant. My mother's hands trembled as she set her glass down too hard, the stem snapping with a sharp crack. I wanted to speak to thank her, but my throat felt locked. My heart pounded, my face flushed hot. My entire body shook with disbelief, and something else I had not felt in years: vindication. Victoria broke the silence with a sharp laugh. She leaned back in her chair, her sequins catching the light as if she were performing on stage. "Of course," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Of course, Claire gets to play dress-up with Grandma's money. She has no career, no ambition, so why not hand her a dollhouse worth $18 million and call it a foundation?" Her words cut like a blade, sharp and poisonous, and the crowd tittered nervously. Some looked at me with pity, others with suspicion. My father let out a bitter chuckle as if agreeing with her. My mother's silence was worse than either of them. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep my eyes on my grandmother. Rose's expression did not waver. She tapped her cane against the stage, once silencing the uneasy laughter. "My decision is final," she said firmly. "Claire has the heart and the vision this family has long forgotten." I felt a surge of tears, not of weakness, but of fierce gratitude. The weight of years of mockery lifted, replaced by something stronger. For the first time in my life, someone had chosen me not out of obligation, but out of belief. The guests erupted into scattered applause again, some genuinely supportive, others eager to be on the right side of power. Cameras flashed as one of the reporters invited to cover the party scribbled furiously into a notepad. I could hear snippets of whispers all around. $18 million. Claire Bennett. Foundation. Victoria's smirk deepened. She leaned across the table toward me, her voice dripping with acid, though her smile never faltered. "Enjoy your little spotlight, Claire. Let's see how long it lasts when the real world chews you up." I met her gaze, my hands trembling under the table. Every instinct told me to shrink back to stay silent, but another voice inside me, steadier now, told me not to. Not this time. I lifted my chin and said quietly but firmly, louder than I expected, "We will see Victoria." For a heartbeat, the room seemed to pause again. My father scowled. My mother avoided my eyes, and Jason finally looked up at me, with something unreadable in his expression. Perhaps the first flicker of recognition that I was no longer the silent sister in the corner. The cake, forgotten, sat melting under the lights. The party had shifted. This was no longer my father's night. This was something else entirely. And I knew the storm had only just begun. The black town car barely slowed before pulling up in front of my parents' colonial on Commonwealth Avenue. The glow from the street lamps caught the frost on the iron gate, making the house look more imposing than ever. My mother didn't speak the entire ride home. My father sat with his arms crossed, his face carved in stone. Victoria scrolled on her phone, her smirk glued in place. When we stepped inside, the warmth of the house did nothing to ease the chill between us. The moment the door clicked shut, my father spun around. His voice was sharp, echoing in the marble foyer. "You will not keep that position. Do you understand me, Claire? You will step aside and let us handle the foundation." I felt the sting in his words but kept my hands at my sides. My mother added quickly, her tone more cutting than pleading. "You embarrassed us in front of everyone. Accepting this role is a betrayal of your father, after all he has done for you." I wanted to laugh at the irony but stayed silent. My chest burned with anger, but something told me silence would hurt them more than words. Victoria let her coat fall onto a chair, her heels clicking against the hardwood as she circled me. I could practically feel her breath on my cheek when she leaned close. "Grandma is old and sentimental. She made a mistake. When she's gone, do you really think anyone will respect you as director? Hand it over now and save yourself the humiliation." Her voice was sugar-laced with venom. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. I looked past her, fixing my gaze on the staircase where Jason stood, hesitating. His eyes darted between us, uncertainty clouding his face. Then for the first time all night he spoke. "Why shouldn't Claire run it?" he asked quietly at first, then louder when no one acknowledged him. "She has vision. She has passion. She deserves this." The room froze. My father turned his head slowly toward Jason, the disbelief in his expression twisting into rage. His hand slammed against the wall. "Passion, vision. You're as foolish as she is. You think I don't see it? You hide behind your engineering degree like it makes you important. You are nothing more than a mediocre builder of machines." Jason flinched at the words, as if they were a slap. My mother's lips pressed together, but she did not defend him. The silence that followed was worse than any shouting. I stepped forward, my voice shaking but strong enough to cut through the heavy air. "Stop it, both of you. I'm not giving up this foundation, and Jason is not what you say he is." My father's face turned crimson. "You dare lecture me in my own house, you ungrateful girl. Everything you have comes from me." I shook my head slowly. "No. Everything I have I built when you weren't looking." The weight of my words hung there heavy and final. For the first time I saw a flicker of doubt cross his face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Victoria rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath. "Pathetic." Jason's fists were clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. I could see the years of silence pressing on him, years of being the obedient son. He opened his mouth again, but my father raised a hand, cutting him off. "Enough, both of you." The tension in the room was unbearable. My mother turned away, her shoulders trembling, though she refused to show tears. The grandfather clock ticked loudly each second, stretching the moment longer. Finally, I broke the silence. "I'm going upstairs." No one stopped me. My footsteps echoed against the stairs as I climbed the house beneath me, still humming with anger. At the landing, I glanced back. Jason was staring after me, his jaw set, his eyes filled with something that looked like regret, but also resolve. I knew this was only the beginning. The storm had followed us home, and it was not going to pass quietly. I barely slept that night, the echoes of my father's voice still vibrating in my chest. By morning, I was sitting in a quiet corner of a coffee shop near Beacon Hill, my hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup that had long gone cold. David Miller slid into the seat across from me. He wore a navy suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression calm, in a way that instantly steadied me. "Claire," he said gently, "your grandmother set this up very carefully. The Rose Grant Foundation is a legally binding trust. There is a board of directors, bylaws, protections. No one, not even your parents or sister, can remove you without cause." I blinked at him, the words barely sinking in. "But they are going to try, aren't they?" He nodded, once his eyes steady. "They already have. I received notice this morning that your family has retained Thomas Greer." The name alone made my stomach flip. Everyone in Boston knew Thomas Greer, the attorney who thrived on high-profile family disputes. If my parents had gone to him, it meant they were determined to destroy me. David leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We will fight this, and we will win. But you need to prepare yourself. It will be ugly." I pressed my palms together, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. The weeks that followed blurred into a haze of legal documents, tense phone calls, and sleepless nights. My parents filed their suit in Suffolk County Court, claiming undue influence and mental incompetence on my grandmother's part. Reading their accusations felt like being gutted from the inside out. They said I had manipulated Rose. They said I had taken advantage of an elderly woman's frailty. On the morning of the hearing, I sat outside the courtroom, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. Jason sat beside me, his hand resting awkwardly near mine, not quite touching, but offering silent support. Across the hall, I saw my parents and Victoria, their heads bent close to Greer. Victoria looked triumphant, her lips curled in satisfaction as if she had already won. David's hand on my shoulder brought me back. "Breathe," he whispered. "Just breathe." The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the benches, their pens poised. The judge, a tall woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, called the case. My knees nearly buckled as I rose with David at my side. Greer painted me as a schemer. His voice dripped with disdain as he described me as a failed artist who saw her wealthy grandmother as a meal ticket. My parents nodded along their expressions, somber, their lies flowing as easily as breath. Victoria even dabbed her eyes with a tissue, pretending heartbreak. When David stood, his voice was calm, measured, and devastating. He produced documents signed years before, showing Rose had begun planning the foundation long before her health ever wavered. He brought forward witnesses, including two of Rose's oldest friends, who testified that the idea had always been hers. Finally, he asked to admit into evidence a letter in Rose's own handwriting, dated 2 years ago, where she described me as the only one she trusted to carry out her vision. As the words were read aloud, my throat tightened. Tears pricked my eyes, but I forced them back. Across the aisle, Victoria's face twisted, her mask slipping for the first time. The hours dragged. My palms were damp, my chest tight. Every time the judge looked in my direction, I braced for the hammer to fall, convinced she would strip me of everything. At last, the gavel came down. The judge's voice rang clear. "The court finds the Rose Grant Foundation valid and binding. Claire Bennett is lawfully appointed as its executive director. The claims of undue influence are without merit. Case dismissed." For a moment I could not breathe. My vision blurred, my body trembling as if the air had been knocked from my lungs. Then it hit me. We had won. A sob escaped my lips before I could stop it. I pressed my hands to my face, tears slipping through my fingers. Relief washed over me in waves so strong, I thought I might collapse. Jason leaned closer, whispering, "I told you you deserve this." On the other side of the room, Victoria stood frozen, her knuckles white as she clutched her purse. My father's jaw clenched tight, his face a mask of fury. My mother's eyes darted anywhere but toward me. The reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing as I wiped my tears. For the first time in my life, the truth had protected me. For the first time, justice had chosen my side. I stepped out of the courtroom into the crisp Boston air, my body light though my legs still trembled. The storm was far from over, but at least now I knew I had the strength to weather it. I barely had time to savor the relief before the attacks began again. Within days, Victoria filled her social media accounts with venom. Posts accusing me of manipulating our grandmother spread like wildfire. She wrote that I had never earned a cent in my life, that I lived off Rose's money, that the foundation was just a vanity project for a failed art teacher. Screenshots of her words landed in my inbox faster than I could delete them. At first I tried to ignore it. But when tabloids picked up the narrative, splashing headlines across glossy covers that called me a parasite, I felt the old humiliation return. Walking down Boylston Street, I overheard strangers whisper my name. Some looked curious, some amused, others skeptical. Each glance cut me deeper than I cared to admit. David called me late one evening. "Claire, this is noise," he said firmly. "The law is on your side, the foundation is real, and the truth will win. Do not engage." But his reassurance did little to quiet the pit in my stomach. Then something unexpected happened. Larger media outlets began reaching out not to echo Victoria's slander, but to learn more about the work we were doing. A Boston Globe reporter sat across from me in the foundation's modest office, recorder in hand, as I explained our mission to fund art programs in underserved schools. For the first time, someone seemed to listen, really listen to what mattered to me. The article ran the following week. It highlighted not only the foundation, but also my personal story, the years of teaching, the late nights lesson planning, the murals I painted with children who had never held a brush before. The narrative shifted. Instead of a parasite, I became an advocate. Victoria raged online, calling the coverage biased, accusing me of pulling strings. But her words rang hollow. Every defensive post she wrote only drew more ridicule toward her. Strangers began defending me in the comments, strangers who knew nothing of my family but believed in the cause. One evening, as I sat at my desk drafting proposals for grants, my phone buzzed with a message from David. "Turn on Channel 7, now." I grabbed the remote, heart pounding, and the screen flickered to life. There, seated in front of the camera, was Emily Carter. I almost didn't recognize her. She was 27 now, her hair pulled back neatly, her voice steady as she spoke. "I would not be who I am today without Claire Bennett," she said, her eyes shining. "She gave me a place to belong when I was 13 and lost. She showed me that art wasn't just about painting, but about believing I mattered." My throat closed. I pressed a hand to my mouth as I listened to her describe the letter she had once written me, the one I still kept tucked away in a drawer. She told the world how I had changed her path, how she had gone on to study design at Pratt, how she now taught art to kids who reminded her of herself. The anchor leaned forward. "What would you say to Claire if she were watching right now?" Emily smiled, tears brimming. "Thank you for changing my life." The screen blurred as my tears fell. Jason texted me a few minutes later. "Saw the segment. Proud of you." 3 simple words, but they pierced through years of silence between us. By the next morning, hashtags praising the foundation trended across Boston Twitter feeds. Donations poured in from people I had never met. A school principal from Roxbury emailed me asking if we could help fund a new after-school art program. Meanwhile, Victoria's fury only grew. She posted videos, her voice shrill, insisting Emily had been coached, that the media was conspiring against her. But the more she shouted, the more people dismissed her. For the first time, her cruelty looked desperate, not powerful. I sat in the foundation office late that night, the city lights glittering outside the window, and felt something shift deep inside me. For so long I had defined myself by the contempt of my family. But now strangers believed in me, children looked to me, and former students like Emily carried forward the work I had once thought meaningless. The storm still circled, but the winds had changed direction. And this time, they were at my back. I landed in Miami with a mix of nerves and determination buzzing under my skin. The city was humid, the air clinging to me as I stepped off the plane, but the brightness of the skyline gave me energy. The Rose Grant Foundation's official launch had been planned for months, every detail scrutinized by David and the board. Yet I could not shake the fear that I would stumble, that the laughter from my father's birthday would echo in the ballroom tonight. The venue was a grand hotel overlooking Biscayne Bay, its glass walls catching the sunset in shards of gold. Inside, the ballroom gleamed with chandeliers, rows of white chairs, and banners displaying the foundation's mission, bringing art and education to children who had been overlooked. As I adjusted the microphone clipped to my dress backstage, I heard the hum of hundreds of voices: business leaders, philanthropists, artists, reporters. It was a crowd I never imagined facing, not as the timid daughter once ridiculed for teaching children how to paint, but as the director of something bigger than myself. David touched my shoulder. "Remember, Claire, this is your night. Speak from the truth, and nothing can diminish you." The lights dimmed. My heart pounded as the announcer's voice carried through the ballroom introducing me. Stepping onto the stage, the glare from the spotlights nearly blinded me, but I kept my chin steady. I began slowly, my voice low but steady, telling the story of how I had once been dismissed, told my work was worthless, called a failure by those closest to me. Murmurs rippled through the audience, heads tilted, eyes fixed on me. Then I let the words sharpen, rising with each sentence. I told them how children's lives were changed by brushes and canvases, how creativity had given kids hope when the world offered none. I paused, took a breath, then said the line that had burned in me for years. I was once told I was a failure, but tonight, I stand here not for myself, but so no child will ever be made to feel small the way I was. The silence that followed was suffocating for a beat, and then the room erupted. People rose from their chairs, applause crashing like a wave. The sound washed over me, louder, longer than I could have dreamed. A standing ovation that seemed to stretch forever, cameras flashing, live broadcasts capturing every angle. My throat tightened, tears stinging my eyes, but I held them back, forcing a steady smile. Reporters swarmed as soon as I stepped off stage. Microphones crowded my face, questions tumbling one over another. What inspired you? How will the funds be distributed? How do you respond to critics who claim you were given this opportunity without merit? I looked straight into one of the cameras and answered with the calm that came from years of silence, turned into strength. I said that no opportunity was ever given. It was built piece by piece through years of teaching children whose gratitude mattered more than applause. I said the foundation was not mine alone, but a collective promise to give kids a voice through art. And as for merit, I invited anyone to walk into a classroom filled with children painting their dreams and tell me it did not matter. The anchor nodded solemnly, the crowd of reporters murmuring, as if my words carried weight beyond what they expected. Later, as the gala dinner began, strangers shook my hand, pledging donations, offering partnerships. A sculptor from New York leaned close and whispered that he wanted to create a traveling exhibition funded by the foundation. A CEO promised $1 million contribution before dessert had even been served. I accepted each word with gratitude, but inside, a small voice whispered, "If only my family could see this." Back in Boston, I knew they were watching. Somewhere in that large house, my father with his glass of bourbon, my mother clutching her pearls, Victoria with her bitter smile, their eyes fixed on the television as my speech replayed across national news. I imagined the silence in that room, the weight of their collapse pressing down the image of me standing tall while they sat small in the shadows. That night in Miami, when the ballroom emptied and I finally stepped outside, the warm breeze of the ocean met my skin. I stood alone for a moment, the city lights glittering across the water, and let the sound of the waves drown out every cruel word that had ever been thrown at me. For once, the noise of the world felt like applause, and I allowed myself to believe that this was only the beginning of something greater. While I was still in Miami attending follow-up meetings after the launch, word began to drift back to me about the choices my family had made. Richard and Margaret had poured their savings and retirement accounts into a glossy new real estate venture with Victoria at the helm. It was pitched as a luxury condominium development, sleek towers rising along the Miami shoreline, marketed to wealthy buyers who supposedly would flock after the pandemic. They called it Horizon Bay, and they boasted to everyone back in Boston that they were about to strike gold. By late 2022, the glossy brochures had lost their shine. Construction stalled, investors pulled out, interest rates climbed higher than anyone had predicted. The market softened until buyers evaporated. By early 2023, Horizon Bay was bankrupt. I heard the numbers whispered before they ever admitted them: $6 million gone, nearly everything they had built their social lives around, swallowed in a matter of months. Friends who once toasted them at parties now avoided their calls. The country club board quietly removed their names from the donor plaques. The neighbors in Chestnut Hill who used to admire their holiday galas crossed the street when passing their house. Shame settled over them heavier than the debt itself. Victoria had promised them she could steer the project to success. Now, with lawsuits from contractors and banks circling, she pointed her finger at Richard and Margaret. "If you had listened to me and moved faster, we would have locked in buyers before the market dipped." Margaret's voice shook with fury as she spat back that Victoria's arrogance had blinded her, that she had no business sense after all. Richard slammed his fist on the dining table, calling both women fools, accusing his daughter of dragging the entire family into ruin. Jason told me later what it was like inside that house. He said the arguments spilled from morning until night, voices carrying down the hallway's doors, slamming, the sound of glass shattering against a wall. He watched his parents pace the floor, blaming one another, then turn on Victoria, only to watch her fire back with venom. For the first time, he said he realized they were not untouchable. The collapse had stripped away the polish, leaving only fear and bitterness. When I returned to Boston briefly for board meetings, I drove past the family home one evening. The shutters were drawn, the once manicured lawn unkempt. I remembered the pride with which Margaret used to host gatherings there, every surface gleaming, every vase of flowers arranged just so. Now the driveway was empty, no guests, no laughter, only shadows behind the windows. Jason met me for coffee downtown, his face weary. He stirred his cup slowly before speaking. "They lost nearly everything, Claire. Dad is blaming Mom. Mom is blaming Victoria, and Victoria is acting like the victim. It is like watching a fire eat through the house while they argue over who struck the match." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping. "Maybe this is just what they deserve." I listened quietly, feeling no triumph, only a hollow echo of what had once been pain. They had mocked me for years, stripped me of dignity in front of strangers. Now humiliation was their constant companion. Karma did not need my hand to guide it. It had arrived all on its own. Still hearing Jason's voice, I realized the fractures were deeper than money. The trust that held them together was gone, burned away by loss. Victoria, who had once strutted with pride, was now scrambling to save face. Richard, who had always spoken with authority, now clung to the hope of another miracle investment that would not come. Margaret's sharp words, once used to cut me down, now tore through her own daughter. I sat across from Jason as he looked down at his untouched coffee, and I saw in his eyes both sadness and release. He did not need to say it aloud. He believed what I did. They had written this ending themselves. When I left the cafe that afternoon, the spring air felt lighter than it had in years. For the first time, their chaos no longer chained me. I walked down the street among strangers who did not know my story, and I let the knowledge settle in me quietly. The fall of my family was complete, and I had not lifted a finger. The boardroom smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee when the receptionist whispered that my family had arrived unannounced. I glanced at the directors gathered around the long table, their files open, their pens poised, and before I could excuse myself, the doors swung open. Richard strode in first, Margaret on his arm, and Victoria behind them like a storm ready to break. The room stiffened. These were men and women who managed millions, who prided themselves on discretion, but even they could not mask their curiosity at the sight of my family barging in. Victoria's heels clicked like gunshots against the floor as she marched forward, her voice sharp before anyone could greet her. "You may be playing executive now, Claire, but you are still a Bennett, and that money belongs to all of us." I rose slowly from my chair, steadying my voice though my chest pounded. "The Rose Grant Foundation is not a family wallet. It exists for the community, for children and artists who deserve opportunity not to patch the holes greed has torn open. Victoria laughed bitter and loud. You think you are above us now because of Grandma's favoritism. Without her, you are nothing but a failed art teacher. The directors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between us. I felt the weight of their silence and forced myself to hold steady. Richard's face reddened, and with a sudden crack, his hand came down hard on the table. The sound echoed across the room, making one of the younger board members flinch. You will not speak to me like I am a stranger in this place, he thundered. Everything you have came from us. You owe us. I looked at him, at the man who had once held my hand, crossing a street, who had once told me to stand tall, and I saw only desperation clawing at the edges of his pride. No, I said quietly. I owe you nothing. What I do here is for the future, not to rescue you from the past. Margaret's voice cut through, thin and trembling. Claire, please, we raised you. We gave you everything, and now you turn your back when we need you most. I steadied my breath, feeling the eyes of every director on me. You raised me to believe my work was worthless. You laughed when I tried to teach, mocked when I built something small. This foundation is proof that you were wrong, and it will not be dismantled to fix your mistakes. Victoria slammed her hand on the back of a chair. Do you hear yourself? You are nothing but a puppet. You sit here pretending to be important while our family name is dragged through the mud. One of the board members cleared her throat softly. Ms. Bennett, this is highly inappropriate. This meeting concerns community grants, not personal disputes. The air tightened, and for a moment I thought Richard might strike again. His jaw worked furiously, his knuckles white against the polished surface. But the eyes around the table held him back, their judgment heavy. Slowly he pulled his hand away. His breath ragged, his dignity in shreds. Victoria muttered under her breath, words sharp enough to wound but too low for the room to catch. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her shoulders shaking. They had come expecting to command, to intimidate, but instead they stood exposed, their hunger and humiliation laid bare for strangers to witness. I gathered my papers calmly, my voice steady as I addressed the directors. I am sorry for the disruption. Shall we continue? They nodded, some offering sympathetic glances, others already scribbling notes as if nothing had happened. My family lingered a moment longer, torn between fury and shame, then turned and left the heavy doors closing behind them. When the echo faded, the room exhaled as one. The meeting resumed, but I could feel the shift. The board had seen the truth of my family's collapse, and in contrast, they had seen me stand unshaken. For the first time, I realized that the dignity I had fought to protect was no longer fragile. It was solid, forged in fire, and it belonged to me alone. The cafe on Tremont Street smelled of roasted beans and fresh pastries, but the comfort of it did little to ease the knot in my stomach as I waited. Jason slid into the seat across from me, his eyes darting around as if making sure no one from the family had followed him. He looked older than his 29 years, his shoulders slumped with the weight of secrets he had carried too long. He didn't bother with small talk. I need to tell you something, Claire. His voice was low but urgent, and for a moment I almost braced for another betrayal. Instead, he leaned in, his hands clenched together. I was jealous of you. I'll admit it. Watching you take risks, seeing Grandma choose you, it cut me in ways I never said out loud. But I never once thought you were beneath me. That was them, not me. The confession sat heavy between us, not sharp, but aching. I searched his face, wondering if I could trust this sudden honesty. Then he sighed, his breath shaking. They pushed me, Claire. Mom and Dad, even Victoria. They begged me to sign that lawsuit with them, said if I didn't, I wasn't a real Bennett. They threatened to cut me out, to say I wasn't their son anymore. My chest tightened. You didn't sign, I whispered. He shook his head quickly. No, I couldn't. But I stayed silent instead, all through the party, through the courtroom, through every headline. I thought if I just kept my head down it would pass. But it didn't. It just ate at me. I stared at the steam rising from his untouched coffee. Silence can wound more deeply than words, and his had cut me in ways I hadn't even acknowledged until now. Why are you telling me this now? I asked softly. Because I'm done hiding, he said, his voice steadying. They can say what they want, disown me if they need to. I'm not standing with them anymore. I'm standing with you. The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything I had believed about being alone in this family war. My throat tightened, and I blinked back tears that surprised me. Jason reached across the table, his hand hovering uncertainly, before I placed mine on top of his. I never hated you, Jason. I wanted you to stand up just once, and now you are. His shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time in years, I saw not the boy caught between loyalty and fear, but a man choosing his own path. He nodded slowly, his jaw set. I'm ready to face them no matter what it costs. We sat in silence, the noise of the cafe humming around us, neither of us moving to finish our drinks. Something fragile had shifted. Something I thought I would never have an ally inside the family, I thought had abandoned me entirely. When we finally stood to leave, the cold Boston air hit us sharp, but it felt less biting than before. Jason walked beside me, his stride hesitant but resolute. The line between us and them was finally drawn, and for the first time I was not standing on it alone. The conference room on the 22nd floor of the Foundation building buzzed with the murmur of voices and the clicking of cameras. Reporters lined the back wall, pens ready, while the board members sat in their polished chairs, eyes sharp and expectant. I adjusted the papers in front of me, steadying my breath. This was meant to be a routine update about our projects, but the moment I saw my parents and Victoria slip into the room, I knew the day would not end as planned. They looked nothing like the family that had mocked me on my father's birthday. Richard's tie was crooked, Margaret's face drawn tight with worry, and Victoria's once immaculate hair fell flat around her pale face. They carried desperation like a second skin, and for the first time the room did not welcome them with deference, but with wary curiosity. "Claire, we need a moment," my father said, his voice rough. He stood awkwardly near the center of the room, trying to command attention, but failing under the gaze of reporters' cameras. "This is a board meeting," I replied evenly, my eyes flicking toward the press, who had already leaned forward, hungry for a spectacle. "If you have something to say, you can say it here." Victoria's composure cracked. Her voice, once dripping with superiority, wavered. "We are in trouble, Claire. The investment failed. The banks are closing in. If you don't help us, we lose everything." Her words ricocheted around the room, and I felt every camera lens focus tighter. Margaret stepped forward, wringing her hands. "Please, sweetheart, just a loan. You have so much now. We only need enough to recover to rebuild." The irony of her plea pressed against me like a weight. I remembered every laugh, every cruel remark, every time they had dismissed my work as childish nonsense. My pulse pounded, but my voice came out calm. The foundation is not my personal wallet. Its funds are for education for children, for art, not to bail out greed. Richard's face flushed red. "We are your parents. Victoria is your sister. Blood should mean something." I leaned forward, my eyes steady on his. "It does mean something. It means you should have valued me when I stood before you with nothing but my work. Instead, you mocked me. Now you come crawling because I have what you want." Gasps rippled through the room. A reporter scribbled furiously. The board members exchanged glances, some leaning back, some leaning in closer. The tension thickened until I spoke again. "I will consider helping, but only on one condition." Victoria's head snapped up, hope flashing. "Anything. You will put in writing what you have denied for years. That you belittled me, that you laughed at my career, that you tried to strip me of my worth. And you will apologize here in front of the board and the press." Silence followed so sharp I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Margaret's mouth opened and closed. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Victoria's face contorted, torn between rage and desperation. "You can't be serious," she hissed. "I am. No paper, no apology, no help." The board chair cleared his throat, leaning forward. "Perhaps we should provide them with a form," he suggested coolly. The implication was clear. This was not just family drama anymore. This was a public reckoning. A staff member slid a sheet of paper across the table, along with a pen. Cameras flashed as Victoria's hand shook while she picked it up. Margaret whispered urgently to Richard, who finally nodded with defeat. One by one, they scrawled their names, each stroke of ink like a nail in the coffin of their pride. When they were done, I picked up the paper, reading their apology aloud so that every person in the room could hear. We acknowledge that we mocked and humiliated Claire Bennett for her chosen career, and we deeply regret our words and actions. The reporters nearly leapt from their chairs. The sound of shutters filled the air, a storm of light capturing every humiliated expression on my family's faces. Richard stared at the floor, Margaret dabbed at her eyes, and Victoria sat rigid, her cheeks burning crimson. I folded the paper carefully, sliding it into my folder. "Thank you," I said quietly but firmly. "Now we can discuss the next steps." The board nodded, some with approval, some with measured neutrality, but the moment was already cemented. The press had their story, and the world would see it for what it was, not just a financial plea, but karma catching up in real time. I glanced at Jason, who had been standing quietly near the doorway. His eyes met mine, filled with something that looked like pride. I breathed out slowly, a release that trembled through me. The meeting carried on, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. For once, I had not been the one forced to bow my head. The tables had turned, and the whole world was watching. The silence after the meeting lingered long after the cameras were gone. I stood at the tall windows of the foundation building, watching Boston stretch out in the late afternoon light, its skyline sharp against the fading sun. The apology letter lay folded in my folder, proof of a shift that no one could undo. My family had taken the minimal aid the board approved, just enough to keep them from collapsing entirely, but nowhere near what they had demanded. The bulk of the foundation's resources remained untouched, safe for the community it was created to serve. I saw them leave that day, shoulders hunched, pride scattered like ashes. For the first time in my life, I had not been the one made small. They had walked out diminished, and I had stayed standing tall. It was not triumph I felt, but something quieter, heavier, a release of years of humiliation turned into a final, irreversible truth. Weeks later, I stood again before a crowd, not in a boardroom, but at the official launch of our first community project. A renovated art center in Miami had been completed, bright walls filled with the laughter of children already painting their first strokes. Jason stood beside me, his hands tucked into his pockets, his eyes softer than I had ever seen them. He had joined as a volunteer, quietly stepping into the role without fanfare. He told me once in private that he wanted to help me build, not just watch from the sidelines. I had nodded, grateful for his presence, and for the bridge that had somehow remained unburned between us. As the children ran past, brushes in hand, I thought back to the words Victoria had once flung at me. Who studies 4 years just to teach kids to draw scribbles? Those same scribbles were now opening doors for children who might never have had a chance. Those same scribbles had become the foundation of something bigger than she could ever have imagined. The reporters who attended that day asked me about the journey. I smiled, speaking slowly, my voice steady. I was once called a failure, I told them. But failure is not defined by others. It is defined by what you choose to do with what you have. And today, what I have is not for myself, but for the next generation. Applause rose, not loud and chaotic, but warm like a wave of affirmation that reached deeper than any recognition I had ever craved. The children clapped too, their paint-streaked hands smudging together, and in their joy, I found the kind of vindication no courtroom or apology could ever give me. At night, when the events quieted, I sat alone at my desk in the foundation office. I opened the drawer and pulled out a small envelope, its edges worn from years of handling. Inside was Emily Carter's letter, written in her careful teenage handwriting almost a decade ago. "You changed my life." I read those words again, and for the first time I felt the full weight of what they meant. The career they had mocked was the very thing that had shaped lives, including mine. I thought of Richard, Margaret, and Victoria. I did not hate them. Hatred would have made me small again, bound me to their cruelty. Instead, I let the truth stand as it was. They had mocked me, and in the end, they had come begging for help. I had given only what was necessary, not out of vengeance, but because dignity demanded boundaries. That was the real victory. One evening, Jason stopped by with takeout. We sat in the office cafeteria, eating noodles from cartons, the city lights glittering outside. He raised his head after a long silence. "You know, Claire, they will never understand you, not really. But maybe that's not the point anymore." I nodded, setting my chopsticks down. "The point is that I understand myself now. And that is enough." The next day, I walked through the halls of the foundation, past classrooms filled with sketches and colors, past studios echoing with laughter. My footsteps were steady, my heart lighter than it had been in years. The building smelled of fresh paint and possibility. As I stood on the stage at the closing ceremony, looking out at the children volunteers and community members, I realized something profound. My life had not been about proving my family wrong. It had been about proving the children right, proving that their dreams mattered, that their scribbles were worth celebrating. I took a deep breath and let the words come not for them, but for me. I did not seek revenge through bitterness, but through truth and justice. They once laughed at my career, then they had to beg me for rescue. That is the definition of karma. And if this story touched something in you, stay with me here, because there are more journeys like mine, stories of dignity reclaimed and justice found, and together we will walk through them, one voice at a time.